classes that you all might be interested in, such as Introduction to Counseling and a few other type of addiction type classes. But we'll also be looking at adding personality psychology and social psychology within the next semester or so. So if you are still going to be here for a while, there'll be more offerings coming up, but that's what we have right now. All right. Here we go. All right, so our job for tonight is to start kind of the introduction to human development, human growth and development. And in this section, I also like to include sections on emotions and motivation and whatnot. So it's kind of a secondary topic, but it's kind of integrated within the conversations of human development and growth because, we have things called emotional maturity, um, you know, motivational maturity, and all of those have to deal with different portions in our life and our understanding of emotions and feelings. So it's kind of integrated within this. But let's start with just the human development aspects that we will be taking a look at. Okay. If I were to give the most basic definition of human development, it's the study of how people change over time. And we'll see here in just a minute that we really focus on basically three domains of change. One is physical change. Um, Second is cognitive, the way we think changes, and socio-emotional aspects, such as human relationships, emotional expression, emotional control, all those kinds of things, and how they can change over time. The difficult part about human development is if we look at the majority of what we know about human development, it's based on children really between the age of 0 to 18. And this is due to some historical misunderstandings. And if we look within the field of psychology, the misunderstandings start with individuals like Sigmund Freud and Piaget, who we'll be talking about today, who said that once we hit the age of 18, we have all of our personality, all our intellectual capabilities, all of our emotional capabilities, and it's set at the age of 18, and nothing else happens um, beyond that. Okay. However, and I should update this, it should, when I started teaching, it was 30 years. It's now 55 years. Over about the last 55 years, more attention has been focused on adulthood. And this is really due to changes in lifespan. Okay. If we look at, for example, our lifespan over the last 145 years, it's doubled. Okay. If we're looking at, so let's say this would be, the 1800s to 1900s, the average lifespan was 0 to about the age of 40. Now, that's not to say there were not a portion of the population that got older. We can look at people like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, all of those historical individuals where, yes, they lived well into their 70s and 80s. But for the mass majority of the population, due to poor health environment, poor access to food, all of those things, the average age, well, the majority of individuals, uh, the expected lifespan was about 40. And then with the advent of modern medicine, modern hygiene processes and washing hands, all of those kinds of things, over about the last 145 years, our lifespan has doubled. Okay. In fact, some what we call theoretical developmental psychologists argue that we actually live two lifespans now. We live a lifespan from about 0 to 40-ish, and one from about 40-ish, 50-ish on. Because what we're finding more in doing research on these age groups is that major transitions tend to happen a lot in the 30s and 40s. We see the highest amount of divorce rates. We see the highest amount of turnover rates with occupations. This is the age group that is most likely to go back to school to learn a new trade or to change occupations. We see a lot of movement during this age group, okay? And so, and we'll also find, and this is, but I don't want to create any gloom for this. We just think that this is a very major transition point for human beings at this point. Um, some of the good things about learning about human beings beyond the age of 18 is that it's not all gloom and doom like we have in the perceptions of our popular media about getting old and frail and sick and losing memory and all of those kinds of things. What we actually have started to find is there's a lot of things to actually look forward to as you grow and develop into older age. So some examples is unless we ruined our bodies in our teen years and our 20s, 30 to 38 year olds are the most physically healthy population. Okay. We find that your highest intellectual capacities, your best decision-making capacities, your ability to do both inductive and deductive reasoning very easily happens between about the age of 45 to 55. And then, unless you've lived a very miserable, lonely life, um, you will find that in older age, when we get above 55 into our 60s, we're actually the most socially engaged. We go out with friends more. We do more with friends. And even intimately, some research has actually shown that the highest sexual satisfaction that has been measured has been in women in the years of this in their 60s. So it's not all doom and gloom, as we will see through our conversations throughout the lifespan. Yes, do we see cognitive declines? Do we see increased risk for things like dementia and other physical disorders as we age? Do we see the body biologically decline? Yes, those are all part of life, but it's not all just all negative. In fact, for the mass majority of individuals up to old age, and when I talk about old age, I'm talking about 70 years and above, much of our physical decline is not a life-changing, going to need nursing type of situation. Now, there is plenty of adults like that, but for the majority, tend to stay pretty healthy and well off up into the age of about, starting around 65 and 70 is when we start seeing more major declines towards ending of our lives. So, but anyways, we'll get to more of that anyway. So there are a couple things that we should note as we get into this. Is if you're interested in human development, it is a very, very exciting period to be a developmental psychologist. With new technologies that we can use to do some experiments and some studies, we find that infancy is like very cool. I love reading the latest research on infants. One of the things that sticks with me the most when looking at studies of infants is that they are actually better statisticians than actual trained statisticians, meaning they actually do better with probability problems than most adults. But then because of language and because we scare kids about numbers and all that kind of stuff, we kind of train that out of them. Unfortunately, starting around the age of 2 or 3, we kind of say, no, 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 you numbers, all that kind of stuff. But it's really kind of interesting to think that there's these little little guys, and if you're a mom or a dad, and if you looked at your infant, you know so much is there and we're barely being able to tap it and really see how cool. which shows that infants aren't born with an empty mind. They're not born just waiting for people to teach them what to do. They have very, very active minds. And as I just mentioned, into adulthood, there are actually new findings about how life is really kind of a progression of different abilities and ways of thinking and physical health and there's things that we can do in our life that make it so we can live a long, healthy, and prosperous life. And that's really kind of fun stuff to really look at. Okay. I would encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to take the Psych 240 class. In fact, if you're going into nursing, this is where a lot of other medical programs. This is actually a prerequisite in a lot of programs that you'll actually be required to take Psych 240, Human Growth and Development, before sometimes you'll even be led into a registered nurse program. But also, if you're going into counseling, social works, if you're a parent, a caretaker, these are important topics. In fact, one of the interesting things when I first went into human services, doing crisis intervention and counseling and stuff like this, I went to all the, my seasoned mentors' offices, and they always had two books in their office. They had the DSM, so they could do diagnostics with their clients, but they always had their human growth and development book. And asking them why, at my young, budding therapist age, they always said, because you have to know where your clients are developmentally if you're going to be successful with them. This is Site 240, Human Growth and Development. Um, and same with a lot of my social worker friends. Always human development books were part of their repertoire of things they kept close to remind them. If I have a 20-year-old, but I have a 10-year-old, they don't have the same capacities or developmental abilities, and I need to make sure that I'm aware of those. So anyways, those are just some different fields that it's recommended that the course, a full course like this, should be taken. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, these are the areas that we're really going to focus on over the next few classes. Okay. We're going to start with biological processes. Okay. Um, we're going to talk about, in this first one, we're going to talk about human drives and how they are biologically tied to a lot of our behaviors and our mental processes. Okay. But biological processes include things like the genetics and family history and physical abilities and those types of things. And one of the things that we should start off with is how biology in humans informs our cognitive and our socio-emotional life. Okay. And you'll notice that this is not set up as a process. This is a Venn diagram. So these all overlap in some way. Because one of the things that I know I probably have mentioned in this class, and I probably have really beaten it to its end, is that humans are not fully biologically developed when we're born. Okay. We're actually born with an underdeveloped brain. Okay. The reason why that has very biological reasons. It's because in order for us to give birth to a child who has a full child-sized brain, the woman's pelvic system would need to expand by about 2 to 3 inches, which I think I don't know anyone who would actually want that. Okay. But our brain is at its capacity to actually exit out of the birth canal. Okay. So it can't get any bigger inside mom's belly. So, unlike a lot of other species, there's only a very few other species that are born like human beings. There's a couple primates, I believe, dolphins, and a few others that aren't born with a fully developed biological brain. Humans' brains don't become mostly developed, meaning physically developed. I'm not talking about the neural connections, the all of those other processes that make us fully developed adults. But the biological mass of our brain doesn't fully develop until about the age of 6. Okay. Meaning that human beings, instead of being fully developed in the biological womb of their mother, we fully develop in our social, cultural, emotional world and in our cognitive, language oriented, analytical, structured world. Okay. So these processes all contribute to each other to make humans who humans really are. Okay. And that's where social, cultural, emotional, social beings. We're not just these biological systems that are just ready and wired to learn how to live and survive in the world. Okay. We're not born that way. So this is just an example of how these processes influence each other. And of course, we know that our socio-emotional world and our cognitive world can influence each other. I think at the beginning of the course, when we were talking about the goals of psychology, we talked about what's known as the rumination process in depression. Okay. So emotional mood processes, so lack of motivation, lack of desire, all of those things lead to wanting to find cognitive proof that we're not worth anything, that we're worthless and we're hopeless. And so we start these cognitive tracks in our brain that are really hard to alter. And so you now have cognitive negative tracks, which are then reinforcing these emotional, social, emotional processes in depression and in anxiety. And then you have the biological aspects, such as differences in neurotransmitters and difference in certain brain structures. So again, when we get to, abnormal section, all of these processes play together. And what we want to know in human development is how do these develop and grow and develop and process over time? Okay. All right. What time are we at? Mhm. All right. So I know we've talked about this fellow before, so I'm not going to go much into his theory much, but what I want to do is talk about his developmental theory. If you remember at the beginning of the class, I mentioned that Sigmund Freud is known because he gave one of our first theories of mental life, of the mind. Okay. But not only did he give us our first theory, he also gave us our first developmental model of human life, which again he set from the age of 0 to 18. Okay. And just as a quick review, remember that this is what kind of gives the biological aspect, because if you remember at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned that Freud very much respected evolutionary theory, which is based on biological theory. Okay. And what he wanted to do is say, what are there two basic biological processes that drive human behavior across cultures, across genders, across anything? And the two that he came up with was Eros and Thanatos. Eros is the growth process. Thanatos is the death process. And then he reduced those down to two very definable instincts. One was sex, and the other was aggression. Okay. And I think we have that model. If you remember this from the beginning of the semester, that these things existed in the id, okay, which is the place where our aggressive and sexual instincts lay, okay. And then if you remember, we have an ego, which is that executive controller between uh, between reality and trying to satisfy the needs of the id. Okay. But the id is completely unconscious. And if you remember, Freud's model is an unconscious model. He believed that all of our behaviors and mental processes, our mind, are driven not necessarily by our conscious choices, but by unconscious desires and need fulfillment, okay, that we're not always aware of. And if you remember when we talked at the beginning of the semester, this is why Freud argued that if you have issues, you need to go to a trained professional who is trained to access your unconscious mind and help you understand what those unfulfilled desires and needs are. Okay. So that's the basis of his model. Do we have, but so one thing that scholars have had issues with is that many people who teach and whatnot in the field always have believed that Freud developed his childhood model before he developed his theory of the id, ego, and superego. But it's actually backwards. He developed this model first, and believe it or not, he never wanted to make his child development model sexual in nature. But he was so tied to this model that he built with the id and unconscious desires and drives that he couldn't, because otherwise he would have to rewrite his entire theory. So our very first model of development in psychology is what is called a psychosexual model. Okay. And we'll just rehearse these for tonight because they have a couple important features to them. One, they set up the kind of theoretical focus for developmental psychologists that things happen in stages, that during certain age groups it's an ultimate time for us to develop certain things that we should know. So kind of a literal one is, for example, language. Humans develop language the easiest around the age of about 2 to 4. After that, we have to put more and more effort into trying to learn a second language or develop our language more. Okay, so that's just an example of what we mean by certain periods of life are best developed to develop certain things. Okay, now when Freud did therapy, um, he worked with a lot of people who had a lot of childhood trauma. And so he came to the conclusion that the early childhood period is the time in which we will develop much of the dysfunctions that we see in adulthood. Okay, so a lot of things, the reasons why we have anxiety, depression, anger issues, all of those things happen in early childhood. Okay, now, while a lot of that can be argued about, later on, I think in this section, we'll talk about something called ACEs, which is early childhood traumas that, when collective enough, can have an impact on later life. So while early childhood doesn't tell the entire story, we do know from modern studies that early childhood trauma does have a heavy influence on later development and therefore the development of other positive or negative human experiences. Okay. But let's rehearse Freud's psychosexual stages to kind of end for tonight. So what Freud felt is that Through our development, in order for us to survive, we have to have certain parts of our body satisfied. And when we talk about satisfied in Freudian terms, we spell satisfaction as sex, okay? Meaning that gratification is the important thing, okay? And so, what is the first thing that infants really need to learn to do in order to survive in this world? Well, they have to be able to ingest nutrients. Okay. Here's the problem with, though, this nutrient idea is that sucking a nipple and trying to get enough nutrients to nutrients the body is a laborious act. No one would ever do this on purpose. If you ever want to kind of know what an infant goes through, I would encourage you to go buy a bottle, put some milk in it or your favorite juice, and try to drink it all to satisfy your own self. Okay. In fact, the reason why baby formulas and breast milk are so filled with fat is because if they didn't have that high fat concentrate, they would be expending more calories than they're taking in. So this is not something that someone would just automatically go, yeah, this is how I want to feed. So we must get some type of gratification out of it, according to Freud. Okay. And so at each of these stages, we can either successfully overcome this need for satisfaction and be able to regulate it, be able to understand it and manage it, or we get stuck in it. Okay, so in this first stage of development, Freud believed that if you weren't able to overcome this need to have oral satisfaction, you became orally fixated. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, in Freudian terms, this means that you have a high likability to become obese because you eat too much, become an addict of some drug or something like that, to constantly need to consume things. He himself believed that he was orally fixated because from a very early age until he died, he had to have at least one cigar a day. In fact, he actually died of jaw cancer because of cigar smoking. Okay. So let's fast forward this to, has this had influence on modern culture? Yes, it has. Okay. If you are one of those people who believe that a person is obese because they eat too much, you're a Freudian. Okay. Because studies after studies have shown that consumption of food is not the only factor that leads to obesity. In fact, a lot of studies show that the majority of obese people don't eat much more or any less than people of non-obese weight. Okay. Yes, there are people who do overeat, and we can't deny that. But there's also people who undereat, and we call them anorexics. Okay. But in the normal biological process of it, overconsumption of food, like a lot of dietitians and doctors still believe, don't actually lead to obesity. So that has been a major influence and is still a major influence in our medical field about dietary intake and those types of things. So something to consider if you're within that group. Um, so after we go through the oral phase, we learn how to consume properly. We learn to chew and eat and do all those things to satisfy our basic biological consumption needs. The next phase of life is an interesting one to me because if there's something that I think we should celebrate in life first before graduating from kindergarten or graduating from high school or getting married or getting a driver's license, I think we should have really good celebrations for potty training. Okay. Because there's two really important things that happen when a child is potty trained. Okay. One is a social reason. Okay. It's going to be the first time in a child's life that they're really going to give in to the demands of an authority figure who is asking them to control themselves and to take care of something at a certain time and a certain place. Okay. The next one is a biological process. It is going to be the first time that a child is going to take control of a natural biological process. And when they need a bowel movement, they're going to learn to control that bowel movement until they're at the place they want to have that bowel movement at. Okay. So not only are we giving into the demands of our social world, we're also taking control of our biological processes. Something I think is pretty significant if we think about it. What did Freud feel happened, though, if you didn't learn how to control your biological needs and didn't learn how to negotiate between you and authority figures in your life? Well, he believed, and this term should sound very familiar to a lot of people, they became anally fixated. Okay. If you've ever called someone anal, you're a Freudian, you're a psychoanalyst. Because what Freud believed is that a person who could not take control of their own biological needs and had issues with social authorities because they couldn't control themselves internally, they take excessive control on their outside world. So this is someone who becomes OCD. This is someone who needs everything to go as planned from beginning to end. This is a person who kind of walks into a classroom and expects everybody to behave a certain way. This is a person that has their shoes in color, size, organization. Okay. This is someone that, according to Freud, is anal or anally fixated. Okay. And that's where that term comes from. Moving us along, and we might just leave the last two for Monday, the latent phase and the genital phase. But I do want to kind of hit on what's known as a phallic phase because it's probably the most controversial of Freud's theories. So I want to give it some a little bit more complexity than what is in popular media about it. So during Freud's time, and in all actuality, you can actually there's actual ultrasounds of infants doing this in the womb. Is something that children naturally do is they touch parts of their body that feels good. Okay. And this is where I do, and if you have kids around, please plug ears and whatnot. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between adult masturbation and child masturbation. Okay. A child will touch themselves naturally because it feels good, because they have a bundle of sensation nerves in certain places of their body that when manipulated feels good. Okay. Adults, however, have to include the notion of fantasization. Okay. So the phallic phase for Freud is simply this: how the family responds to when they walk in on the child doing something natural. Okay. But here's a piece of parenting advice that is not just Dr. Peterson's advice, but you'd get from anyone who has dealt with child sexual abuse. Okay. Is if you walk in on your child and they are touching parts of their body that have a lot of nerve endings, first thing to do is not freak out because then you're just going to scare your child and not be able to have an open conversation with them. But calmly asking them why they feel the need to touch those parts of their body is important. And this is why. If they say because it feels good, then they're just doing what every child does. But if they say something like, well, Uncle Bill showed me, or someone told me how to do this, or someone has me do that to them, then there's a deeper conversation that needs to take place. But if you start out with the anger and the surprise and all of that, that ability to get the true story of that child becomes more and more difficult. Okay. And then after you know the reason the child is doing what they're doing, then you can have the family moral conversation about touching oneself and who should and who shouldn't based on your morals, law, legal statutes, moral statutes, community statutes, all of those kinds of things. Then you could have that conversation. But unless you know why, it's really difficult to have that appropriate conversation. Okay. So for Freud, what happens if someone can't overcome their need to gratify themselves? This for Freud is what creates things like people who are thrill seekers, people who need constant gratification, people who seek instant gratification, which, according to other studies that we'll look at, lead to other things such as academic difficulties, things like ADHD, if you want to make that argument. Those types of things then can develop because of that inability to control one's need to self-gratify. Okay. Now, the most complex or controversial part of this age group is what Freud called the Oedipus complex and what later Carl Jung would call the Electra complex for girls. Oedipus it comes from a Greek story where in the end a boy kills his father and has sexual relations with his mother. I am going to tell you the story is much more complicated than that. Oedipus would have been the last person with this type of disorder. He did everything he could to avoid having that myth that he was going to grow up and marry and have relationships with his mom. But this is kind of the what Freud wanted to explain is the young boy wants to learn about love and who is the love object in that boy's life. The first love of his life, as you would say, well, it's mom. But who's interfering between the relationship between mom and him is his dad. Okay. So what does the young boy do? He takes on the behaviors of the father, learns how the father interacts with mom, how he treats her, so that then he learns how then to have that relationship with her as well. Okay. The Electra complex is the same. It gets a little bit darker. It gets into things like penis envy and all of those things. But it comes down to the same basic concepts that the girl wants to have relationships with her father, who's interfering with that relationship while it's the mother. So she takes on the qualities of her mother to take over that sensual relationship with the father. Okay. Now, we're going to end with this. Remember, I said that Freud was stuck on having to use the terms of his theory in order to explain some things. So I want to give a more non um, non, in my opinion, gross interpretation of this. Okay, is we have been living in decades enough where we have had enough children raised by single mothers and single fathers. And I'm going to tell you right now, single parents in the room, you have all my gratitude and all my admiration. And I'm thankful for what you do in raising your children and taking care of them. The population, though, that I would be interested in looking at is there is a subset of mothers and fathers where the mother raises their son with no male influence. Okay, meaning they keep away from their boyfriends and intimate partners, keep them away from uncles and whatnot, and they they kind of guard them, and probably justifiably well because of the experiences they had. But we also have a subset of fathers who raise their girls with no female influences. So they keep them away from aunts and grandmas and intimate partners and girlfriends and all of those things and try to guard them from probably going through things that they went through. And we have found no matter, and we've had a few research things come out even on same-sex relationships where children who were not exposed to the same-sex role models through their childhood tend to have difficult times in relationships when they become adults. So the young girl who was raised by the dad who was guarded over her tends to have relationship issues in adulthood. Okay. I mentioned same-sex relationships because we have found that a single mother who guarded their son, even if that son is gay, will have difficult times in that gay relationships because what they're learning during this 4 to 6 times is how to treat people you care deeply about. And it occurs in both a same-sex and opposite-sex way. Okay. And I think if Freud were to rewrite his theory, I think that that would be what he was trying to get at during this age. Because what we know about this age is there's a very important type of play children engage in. And it's make-believe play, it's role modeling play. So, for example, the little boy or girl goes and watches Superman, and then they wrap around the towel around their neck and they jump off the couch and they realize they can't fly. But maybe they still have some of other qualities Superman has. We go play firefighters. We go play house. We go play doctor. We could do all of these things where we view adult life and then we go try them out. And when those adult things are not provided for the child to experience and to try out on themselves, it's hard for them to learn it and to grasp an understanding of it later in life. And I'll end with this example because if you were to ask me about this, my parents, when I grew up, and I think this is what aims towards this point in understanding what Freud was trying to get at. My parents, at a very young age, before I was born, agreed that they would never, ever, ever argue in front of me and my brothers. No arguments, no showing anger. Yeah, I saw dad run out of the house and get in his car and drive around the block a couple times and then come back. I saw emotions, but my parents refused to argue in front of us. In adulthood, even 30, 40 years later, I still have difficulty going through, especially what would be considered aggressive or conflictual arguments and behaviors with my own spouse. Okay. And I think that's what Freud was trying to get at. And why, if you go to a developmental psychologist today, and you're doing parenting classes, they will say, yes, argue in front of your children, but also model how you resolve those arguments. Model how you do it healthy and make sure they know how to understand that conflict and how that conflict can be resolved. But anyways, that's more of a soapbox I think I'm getting on right at the moment. But that is the kind of the message I think was sent. But we're getting around 6:10, and I want to make sure we honor you guys' time. So we'll leave the last two phases are not as detailed as these three. So we'll get through those within the first few minutes of